Good morning. We're at week 2 of our human rights unit, and I just want to do a quick review over what a human right is. Remember, it is universal. It's believed to belong to every person. Now, that doesn't mean that you get them all the time regardless. If you break the law, all societies understand you're going to lose some of your rights. But those basic rights should be available for all people in most situations. That's the concept of a human right. Now, I want you to think about this. Now, you're 19 years old, and you just found out the government has passed a law that directly affects you and your family. It's going to bring back the draft. That's where the military is going to take you, whether you like it or not. You are forced into service, and it applies to all young men and women under the age of 25. Well, what can you do about it? Obviously, voting age is 18, so voting is an option, but one election every 2 years for Congress, one election every 4 years for president. That seems like a long-term solution that may not help you out right now. Don't worry, the Constitution's got you covered. We're going to talk about protest forms, not only historically, but what you have available today. Remember, protest is expressing an opinion to a decision or a policy. It can be government or it can be non-governmental. Many people protest companies. Think about the NFL and the Black Lives Matter movement. Government is constantly trying to balance out people's right to protest with its national security concerns. In the last 30, 40 years, we've seen government kind of side more with the national security concerns, but traditionally, individual rights have won out. But this is all based on the First Amendment. The fact that it is the First Amendment should tell you how the Founding Fathers felt about protest. Remember, these are the people that threw tea overboard to protest British taxes. And so this is just a quick diagram of all the protest options. Now, there's two ways, of course, you can go with a protest. You can be violent or nonviolent. The risk with violence, of course, is you're going to be arrested, and just as importantly, if not more importantly, you're going to lose a lot of credibility in the eyes of some. So nonviolent protest, at least in American history, has been the most effective way in order to get the country behind your efforts and to support your ideas. Let's talk about political protests. This is essentially using voting and other governmental systems, mechanisms to stop an injustice. Petition, again, part of the First Amendment. It's where a bunch of people sign a document that states that they have a certain policy. They want to see a new direction in a government or non-governmental policy. The ability to assemble, when you think of the March on Washington in 1963, this is assembly. Marching, we covered so much of this, even though we call it a March on Washington, I would argue more that the March of Selma, Alabama, and the attacks that happened on the black and white protesters there. This is simply walking to a rally to kind of advocate and advertise change. And then, of course, the most effective way that we have in any governmental change, voting. When people are unhappy with the direction of the government, they go a new direction. That's the best way to voice your opinion. We covered the Olive Branch petition, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. You may want to pause and go through some of the comments on here. But essentially, what is it that the colonists are looking for is what I'm asking for. So this gives you an idea of one of those other First Amendment freedoms, the freedom of press. And you can see, the majority of the world does not guarantee newspapers and other media outlets the right to freely express their opinions on something. You happen to be lucky you live in one of those few countries that does have a largely free press. Let's talk about economic protests. So yes, there is the governmental route, but sometimes you got to use financial motivations to encourage and to guide change. Boycott. In a boycott, this is where you're refusing to buy a product to punish or to protest. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott in the early 1950s. We're not going to go on a bus. We're going to bankrupt the bus system until you make substantial changes. And it worked. A strike. This is where workers refuse to actually do the job, and it forces a business to change their policies. And then, of course, there's lawsuits. There's always the option for legal actions in court in order to force a change or to at least state your protest. One of the more famous examples of a boycott would be the Stamp Act. So when the British would tax American goods, Americans would, of course, respond, stating that they weren't going to pay a tax. In some cases, they weren't going to buy imported British goods anymore. And just remember that last year when we talked about what the heck does the bottom right picture mean? What's it saying about stamp collectors and how Americans feel about them? When we look at the Global Rights Index and how people are treated or how they list themselves of their treatment, you can see, once again, you're fairly lucky to live in the United States. It could be a lot worse. There unfortunately are other alternatives to protest. We call them extra-legal or outside the law. This is where you reject the law or you understandably ignore it. Now, in the one case that I think most Americans did respect was civil disobedience. This is what Dr. King used. He understood he was going to get arrested. These protesters knew they were going to get arrested, but they refused the orders of a government official as a protest. They did it peacefully, though. Rioting is the ugly part. We saw this a year and a half, 2 years ago in Reno, where people in downtown Reno along Virginia started rioting, throwing bricks, trying to set buildings on fire, threatening police. They eventually had to call out the military to help restore order. And then the ultimate revolution. We've seen that in the United States in the 1770s, in Mexico a couple of times, Russia in 1917. This is where you are completely throwing out the governmental system in place and putting in something else. Think back to the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre. The advertisement of that Boston Massacre. Here's a great example. You can see here that this was actually not painted in the 1760s. This image became much more popular and much more prevalent after the 1760s when African American issues rose to the front. Now, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to do a lot of this, but I did want to go over some democracy. So let's talk about how democracies work in shaping public opinion. One of the easiest ways is what we call protest music. Now, the man you see in the picture here is John Lennon. He is one of the members of quite possibly the most popular, the most impactful group of all time, the Beatles. Protest music helps shape and share a message. And I'm going to post on the website, if YouTube will allow me, a little overview of protest music as part of this. So if you're interested in finding out more, obviously we're going to watch it in class, and then if you're not there for class, you can watch it on Teams. But the idea is to communicate those messages and those themes to the illiterate, and then of course today to communicate that to people who otherwise wouldn't read it. Let's face it, a lot of the protest music today in your generation comes in music because a lot of students and a lot of people your age don't really go out of their way to read other people's ideas and to keep up on the news. You tend to see a lot of anger over injustice, over how minority groups are treated. So we're not going to have any time on this video presentation, but I would recommend if you are interested, take a look at a couple of these songs. And we are, at the end of the week, going to be doing a web quest where you guys are going to be choosing one of these songs and examining it in detail. But what are the issues? What is it the singer is using? How does the musical style sort of inform you about their opinion? If you have any questions, please let me know, but that is protest in a nutshell. You're going to need this in order to complete your project, which we're going to start next week. I hope everyone's going to have a great week this week. We'll see you later. Please let me know if you have questions.